Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag Gamble, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together, we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So this week on the show, I welcome back a good friend and fellow permaculture teacher, Looby Macnamara. She runs the Applewood Permaculture Centre in the UK, a permaculture teaching space with her family, and she's also authored 4 books. So her first book was People and Permaculture, followed by a fabulous little book called 7 Ways to Think Differently, which she tells me is just about to be released as a free ebook. So I'll give you information down below of how you can access that. She wrote a poetry book called The Strands of Infinity, but her latest book, which is the book that we're talking about here in this conversation, has just been released by Permanent Publications, called Cultural Emergence. So essentially, it's a toolkit for regeneration. She gives a whole lot of principles and processes that support us to actually help to work towards this cultural emergence. So Loobys has been a permaculture teacher for a couple of decades now, and her focus has been particularly on developing the work around social permaculture, around the people care ethic. And this book and this conversation is really an extension of that into looking at not just individuals, but together how we can start to shift cultures in a way that is going to help us to address the climate crisis. And in fact, in her book, she writes the climate crisis is a symptom of a cultural crisis. And so the response is actually working at that cultural level. So grab a cuppa, sit back, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Looby as much as I did. So thanks for joining me on the show again, Looby. Last time you were on the show, I was actually at your place and over in England at Applewood Permaculture Centre. And I don't think I had a voice then. So this time it's really nice to actually be able to talk to you properly rather than the kind of a whisper that I had. So anyway, before we get started, I just wanted to check in too with you. You've been in lockdown almost since I saw you last. How are you going? How's things in your part of the world?
Yeah, it's I think you were here a year before that. I don't think it's been quite that long.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was that. Gosh, that year has flown. That's right. It was almost a year
Yeah,
before.
so it was because it was we both got children who have the same birthday, and it was near their birthday. And but yes, we have been. Been nearly a year of lockdowns, relaxed, and trying to get back to normal and back to lockdown. So it's been it's been 11 months now of kind of complete pattern disruption on so many different levels.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I lean into the practice of gratitude, and that's been really helpful in these times to just appreciate that and to understand what's happening in terms of pattern disruption and how that is impacting us on different levels.
And I think your work started with permaculture and then evolved into social permaculture, and now you're describing it as cultural emergence. And I want to sort of dive into that and unpack that a bit as we go along. But I just wonder, you've mentioned pattern disruption, and in that context of cultural emergence, what's been your observation or your thoughts around COVID, pattern disruption, and cultural emergence? Where's your mind going with that?
Well, if we start with my working definition of culture as this complex web of patterns, of seen and unseen patterns of thinking, behaving, feeling, interacting, and if we think of that as cultures, there's many definitions of culture, but that's one that I like to use. And during I pre-COVID times, that complex web of patterns is quite fixed and quite stable. It moves through the seasons. It does move, but what's happened during COVID is that pattern has become completely unraveled because it's a web of patterns. So you change one thing and then suddenly all the other patterns shift. So you change your work patterns, and then your eating patterns change, and then your sleeping patterns change, and then and then you start to question your values and your beliefs, and things that were unseen before have started to come up to the surface, like global inequalities, like the distance that it feels comfortable to be talking to a stranger or a close friend, or an acquaintance. That we had unseen patterns of where we would stand in relation to someone, and we probably didn't give it much thought until someone stood a bit too close, and you're like, I don't really know you that well, why are you standing so close? And but now, since COVID, of course, we're all really aware of how close we're standing to someone, and it's like, okay, I know that I'm only socially distanced enough when it feels awkward. And so all these patterns and these values and these cultural priorities have come to the surface, and they haven't quite landed yet for people into where or they have, some of them have, but then they keep on changing again, like, oh, okay, our children have gone into school and then they've come out of school and now they're doing online schooling, but in a different way to how they were before. So it's just constant pattern disruption, which can be quite tiring for people. And in cultural emergence, I talk about 3 different phases, and we need to have them in balance for this fertile cultural emergence to happen. And one of the phases is challenge and awaken. And this is where you get pattern disruption, you get awareness of culture, you get awareness of systems and how interconnected all these systems are. And those are all practices that will help activate the challenge and awaken phase. And we've gone into this global challenge and awaken phase that has made us feel challenged and awoken, even if we're not struggling in terms of our health or finances or work, although a lot of people are struggling in one area or another. But even if we're not, we still are immersed in this collective challenge and awaken phase. And then the other 2 phases are the move and invigorate and nourish and empower. And those phases are not getting as well activated. And so we're a bit out of balance. So that would be one of the things that we kind of collectively need to do, is to bring those other phases more to the forefront to balance it and to help us emerge the regenerative culture that we want.
I like something that you wrote in your book that I really liked, and it was talking. Well, there's lots of things that I really like, but there's one point just connected to that. It's a sense of that we have a collective sense that the culture is something out there, whereas how you're describing it is actually something about how it's our relationship with the patterns that we're connected with. You want to just talk about that a little bit, about it's like how we can really be seated in that sense of culture so that we can then be a collaborator for that emergence.
Yeah, it's true. Culture is one of these words that we use all the time, but we're not very sure how to define it, or when we tend to think of it as, our country or something really quite big and immutable, really. And actually, if we go back to that definition of the complex web of seen and unseen patterns, we see that we all have our own unique complex web of patterns that comes from all the different cultures we're part of. And if we think of, in permaculture, we talk about microclimates, and that we're really aware of how the microclimate, even on the same piece of land, can be very different from where it's the sunny part of the land and the shady part and the wind tunnel and the frost pocket, and all these different microclimates within a larger climate. And we can think of the same thing in terms of culture, that there's many cultures nested within each other. So we might be part of, you and I might be culture, part of or we are part of the macro culture of being a woman, which is a global culture, and part of the culture of speaking English. Then we're part of very different cultures, with you being in Australia and me being in the UK. I'm in winter here with all my warm clothes on at the beginning of the day, and you're in Australia in the heat even at the end of the day. So we've got different macro climates and macro and micro climates, as well as macro and micro cultures. And the smallest micro culture is yourself. And I'm sure most people, even when they think of it in this way of being a complex web of patterns, they recognize that their complex web of patterns is different from their partners or their children, or their flatmates or their parents. And when you start thinking about it like that, it seems obvious. Yes, I've got a very unique complex web of patterns that no one else has. And some of those patterns I will have inherited from my parents, some from the media, some from my friends, some from my education, my dietary choices, all sorts of different places that I inherit parts of that web of complex patterns that makes this unique mosaic that is very specific to myself.
I want to jump to like a big meta culture, or a way of thinking, I suppose. Another point that you mentioned in your book was that the climate crisis, I'm just going to read it here, the climate crisis is just one symptom of the deep cultural crisis. And I thought that was a really interesting statement because, often we point to the climate, this is the issue, and what you're describing it as a symptom of something broken in that system of relationships. And I was going to also ask you kind of about, well, where is it that we're stuck? And maybe that's part of this, like we have a cultural crisis, and where is that stuckness and how do we come unstuck?
I mean, part of that is that there's these unseen patterns. So we start thinking of the seen patterns of behavior and pointing fingers at that those things need changing, but those things arise from the unseen patterns, the beliefs, the priorities, the cultural tolerances that we have. And the thing is that we tend to perceive those as, if we do perceive them at all, we tend to think of them as quite kind of fixed and cultural givens that our political system, for example, will act in this way. Whereas they're not givens, they could be different, but we need to explore them a bit more, bring them to the light and question them and say, well, is that really what I want? So on a personal scale, maybe we have the pattern of having a mid-morning snack, and we keep that pattern, which used to be really relevant to us when we'd get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and have breakfast then and cycle to work and then need a mid-morning snack to keep us going. But maybe we're now working from home, getting up 2 hours later, but we're still having that snack and not questioning it. Do we need it? Is it still serving us that pattern? And on a much bigger scale, then we've got these political systems that aren't actually serving the climate. They're not serving the people. They're not fit for purpose anymore. But how do we change them? How do we actually come to the realization that they're not serving us and redefine them? Which is, of course, huge questions to ask. Even that understanding that it is a cultural issue helped us to look in the right direction for solutions.
I was just going to ask you, what do you think are some of those starting points of helping us to get unstuck from a cultural emergence perspective? And I think what you just said then is that awareness and seeing where sort of the root of the challenge is, that we can start to sort of build up a different approach. One of your previous books was 7 Ways to Think Differently. And in a way, it's absolutely that. I mean, in order to solve the issues that we're facing right now and bring the change that we need, it's not about throwing tech at it. It's actually about thinking differently. And then if we have tech, it fits within that different thought pattern, the different way of perceiving our relationships and our cultures and our understanding. So, you've been very much focused on that the ways of thinking differently. I know that you embedded that too in Cultural Emergence, your book. I saw that you've included the 7 ways of thinking differently there. So maybe if you could just mention a little bit about the 7 ways of thinking differently, and a little bit around that idea of, where do we start with that? So using the different thinking, what flows from that as some starting points that people can kind of grab a hold of, like maybe even some practical examples of how you've utilized it in, like your community. I know you've got something you call the great collaboration, in your local area. What does that manifest like in a community?
Yeah, so the origin of 7 Ways to Think Differently was thinking about what permaculture has given to so many of us beyond the garden. That actually, yes, we have gone into our gardens, our farms, our small holdings, and redesigned them, and created these really healthy, productive systems. So it's like, how do we create healthy, productive systems in our businesses, in our relationship? And we do that through shifting those thought patterns that then enable us to manifest differently out into the world. And then it was like, okay, so if permaculture is a way of thinking differently, what does that actually mean? And that's where I categorized it into the 7 different ways of thinking. Sorry, I've lost your question.
Oh, I was just asking. I know it was a very big question. Sorry about that. It was
many questions.
Sorry, I should chunk it up a bit more. What I was asking after that was, so we need to be thinking differently, and the 7 ways of thinking is a fantastic way to sort of be able to see that and see that different type of thinking. When I read through it, it's a great little book, and it's so clear, and it helps us to understand that. The next part of the question was really around, well, so if we understand about thinking differently, how does that then translate into how we could start to act differently? What's that call to action, and what are some ways of starting that? Like, how do we action that new collaboration? And maybe you've got some examples of something you've seen working in that way.
Yeah, so I think it is bringing a whole kind of level of different understanding to how we approach life, and that really then ripples out from there into all the behaviors we have, and to be able to make that connection between how we're thinking and also how we're conditioned to thinking, because each of the ways of thinking that I identified had a corresponding kind of mainstream narrative around it, like a negative mainstream narrative that fed the opposite belief. So, for example, the first way of thinking is abundance thinking, and we are fed as consumers with our adverts of around scarcity thinking, that what we have isn't enough. So the home we have, the sofa we have, it isn't big enough, it isn't comfortable enough, it isn't bright enough, it isn't, or the phone we have, it isn't small enough. It's like this thing of not enough is the narrative that we are constantly fed with all the advertising. That is how advertising works, is it says what you have isn't enough, you need this. And it's quite subtle to understand that is the message we're being constantly fed. Once you engage with that, and I'm sure many people listening to this will already know it, and then many people will also be able to really identify it as soon as it's kind of brought to awareness, as soon as it's moves from the unseen to the seen. And so shifting to abundance thinking, so within permaculture, it's more about valuing what we have and shifting our thinking from that's waste to how can that be used and become resources. So that shift from waste to resources, from something being a liability to an asset, from being a problem to a solution, that thinking comes from abundance thinking. It doesn't come from scarcity thinking. And being grateful for what we have is a part of that abundance thinking. It's the doorway into abundance thinking. So when we become aware of these unseen patterns, and this links in with the work of cultural emergence, is to recognize the cultural conditioning that we have, that all of us are constantly being culturally conditioned. And when we recognize that, then we can start to say, well, how would we actually like that conditioning to work, and start reprogramming our thinking patterns that then reprogram how we operate in the world. And that so that's very awareness of culture, and awareness of our thinking patterns that we've been conditioned with, help us to unpick that conditioning, to actually question it. Is that really my own beliefs, or is that something I've been conditioned with? And that questioning can start to just unpick
Looby,
those stories. And
where did it? Where did that come for you? Where did you? What began your thinking in this direction? How did you find permaculture, and what kind of fuels your inner flame to continue this work? Because you've also been doing this for a very long time. So what is your inner flame with this?
I'll start with with my journey with permaculture, and then carry on to the second interesting question about what flame fans my flame. I did my permaculture design course when I was doing my university degree. And there's a huge contrast between my university degree, which was human sciences, and it was anything with enology, ecology, anthropology, biology, philosophy. And they were all quite separate things. And then I'd go to my permaculture course, which I did over weekends. So I'd be doing university Monday to Friday, and then come to Saturday. And I had so much fun during my permaculture design course. So there was a lot of fun and collaborative learning, and a lot of recognition that we don't know all the answers, which was quite a contrast to university, where we were kind of expected to regurgitate a lot of the answers that were out there, and not give our own ideas in there. And the other thing that the permaculture did was it made these threads of connection between the ecology, between the anthropology, between the philosophy, and made lots of these threads of connection there, which was really valuable. So I came to permaculture not as a gardener. It was my first experience, and the delight of growing my first crop of Swiss chard and being able to eat it. But that was that was the only crop I grew, and it was it was the way it was taught that really captured my imagination and made me think, yes, this is what I want to carry on doing. And then after teaching for a while, it was like, I heard it several times, of this point that we have earth care, so we have all the earth care solutions we need on the planet for vast earth care and earth repair. We have those existing already. We don't need more solutions. We know how to plant trees. We know how to collect rainwater. We know how to grow food. That's not what's limiting us. It's the people care that's limiting us. And And what is it about the people? It's about every single level, from our own personal energy up to international politics. It limits us in so many different ways. So with permaculture, as you know, when we have a limit, we flip it around. So a limit becomes a need for our design. So we need more people care. We need to examine our culture. We need to examine our thinking. We need to examine the cultural narratives that have led us to where we are at the moment. And so that's been my journey to really focus our attention on that, because I do believe that if we can shift our thinking, if we can shift those cultural narratives, that then we will shift direction. I love your arrows there, and in the background, the food forest. It's like where's your where are we pointing with our cultural narratives? What do we believe will happen? What are the priorities? What is our role to play within that cultural narrative as well? And so we haven't yet spoken about this word emergence, but I think this is where the answer to the next question lies in this. The next question of what keeps me inspired and keeps me going, and it's this concept of emergence, which is a systems term, and it's when we put things together. So we have this 1 + 1 = 1. 1 + 1 = 3. So it's like more than the sum of the parts. And that is like synergy. It's like we get more, but it's more of the same. And with emergence, we have this indefinable leap to something different that has some emergent properties. So we have 1 + 1 = blue, or a spiral, or something unimaginable that wasn't present before in the one. It's something completely different, and it's like this whole quantum leap. And we have emergence around us all the time. With the water we drink, we can't tell from looking at this that this is hydrogen and oxygen here, and it has all these different properties that neither hydrogen or oxygen have, and it's our life force. And emergence is around us so much that we take it for granted and we don't see it anymore. But I believe that when we contribute and we give our gifts into the greater whole, when we start moving together and we start acting more like a starling murmuration than can't think of something, than something in conflict and pulling in different directions. When we start moving like that, as that we will create this harmony that will actually move us into this whole different way of being on the planet, that will move us away from this climate emergency into a nourishing, fertile cultural emergence. And that's what gives me hope, and that can happen, and that the more we find our gifts, the more we contribute, the more we hold on to that vision, the more likely it is to happen.
So I wanted to ask you too about, you mentioned in your book about deep adaptation, and I'm thinking, so maybe if you could just describe how you see the relationship between permaculture, deep adaptation, cultural emergence, and maybe something too about the pace of change and are we moving fast enough? Is our current pace of addressing it through, the small and slow solutions, where do you see the permaculture solution fitting in that, the need for a quite dramatic shift really in how we're doing it? And I think, like we've all been thrown into, like you're saying, the disruptive force of COVID has kind of like cracked open enormous possibilities for something to really shift quite dramatically. But I'd just love to hear from you, like with that deep adaptation, particularly in that climate response to an extinction. You know, we've got the extinction, we've got the climate, all these discussions were happening, and particularly strongly in the UK, you know, before COVID. And then just where you feel we need to move with that.
There is kind of many levels, aren't there? And there's the you know, when I focus on like if I focus on my own personal level and, you know, what I see happening with course participants, with friends on community level, and how we can really move tremendously and really shine and really find our life purpose and you know, feel grounded, that was really hopeful. And then on a you know, the bigger level of you know, the planet as a whole, and the trust that I have in the more than human world to adapt and respond and to be resilient and you know, come back from what's thrown at us, that's really comforting and grounding as well. There's a sort of the level that is, I think, for a lot of people most challenging is when we focus on the political level and the sort of larger scale cultural levels, and how that you know, that feels quite disempowering and disheartening, and that it's, you know, the conversations aren't even happening there, let alone the solutions being found. You know, they're not even focusing on the right problems. So you know, that can be really difficult.
I'm sorry, we just had someone trying to join us. Did you see that? Someone popped in.
That's right.
I just dropped this little chunk. Yeah. I just removed her. Hopefully she won't come back. All right.
She's someone you know.
A new student, but I don't have anything on tonight. She must just be testing. I'm going to have to get a separate link for podcasts so that people can't just accidentally drop in. But sorry about that. So you were talking about the bigger picture. We're exploring sort of that pace of change or the scale of change, but you also talk about, you know, cultural emergence being about creating lasting change, and I think this is a really important part, that it is much about local. It is about deep change and lasting change, and I think this is a really important part of what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, so with cultural emergence, it isn't an end point, a destination that we're heading for. One of the premises of cultural emergence that it is an ongoing process, that we have to continually be redefining our culture and checking it is moving in the direction that we want it to, which is part of the problem that it is being quite static. In some ways, of course, in other ways, you know, for those of us that can remember life pre-internet, of course, it's dramatic shifts there. But has the you know, has the political system changed over that time? It hasn't really. So there's but it's this ongoing process of examining our culture, redefining it, we're redefining it within the current context, which changes as well. And you know, this is the question: is it, are we acting quick enough? Well, no. We're not, you know, we as our political systems, as a global community, no, we're not working quick enough. We're still suggesting solutions that come from the same cultural narrative. So the shift from petrol cars to electric vehicles isn't going to solve the climate crisis. It's just kind of replacing one problem with another problem. It's like, actually, how can we invest in public transport? How can we relocalize? How can we meet our needs more locally? Those are the questions that we need to be asking, and there, rather than can we change to electric vehicles or not. So it can feel quite frustrating about the pace of change. And we were talking about, you asked about deep adaptation, and I can see the value in having that awareness that huge collapse can happen. It also maybe is a bit disempowering for people. On the one hand, on the other hand, it can feel like that's the only way it's going to go, and the only way how we're going to kind of break out of this trance that we're in as humans, that we are in control, that we that we are the most important species on the planet. All of those kind of beliefs that are shaping how we act on the planet at the moment, and bringing us to destructive ways.
So I just to come back into your book, because your book is full of principles and processes and tools. So it really is a kind of like a guide to help us along this journey. Can you just share a little bit about what kind of tools and processes people will find in there to help them to get into this in a deeper way?
Yeah, there's like keystone practices, so things that will really activate the phases that I talked about at the beginning. And we've got awareness of culture and sensing systems, which are the keystone practices for the challenge and awaken phase. And then the move and invigorate phase is the keystone practice is manifesting through design and action. So that's that shift with the design, that thinking things through. And we do this a lot in permaculture, is actually design systems. So we think through the connections, we think through our vision and our limits and our resources, the patterns and reflection, and create action plans, and then actually do things, implement the designs. And so that brings us into the move and invigorate phase. We feel like we're not stagnating. We're not just in that challenge and awaken, that overwhelm, or the rabbit in the headlights. Is actually like, okay, this is happening. This is what we need to do. And it would be lovely to see that being reflected in our political systems, of clear action plans of, okay, how do we design our way out of the pandemic? How do we design our way out of the climate crisis and into climate health? And also we can use that on small levels for ourselves. How do we design increasing our skills, or looking after our elderly parents, or all sorts of things we can use that design framework for, which is the design web, which I created in People and Permaculture. And then we've got, for the nourish and empower, we've got the keystone, which routines, which are connection practices, and that's connecting to ourselves, connecting to other people, and connecting to the more than human world as well, and bringing ourselves into alignment and resourcing ourselves through those connections. And what I've found is that those different components, there's other practices as well that support these, that has this extra emergence through those connections of all those things. So the cultural awareness will lead our designs to be more effective, and the connection practices will enable us to be more aware of our culture. So there's this web of connections between those keystone practices that support us to bring those into balance as well.
And then a lot of people who've been listening to this are also be either permaculture teachers or starting to be a permaculture teacher as well. So I imagine that these processes and principles could also be used to help design really wonderful education programs. And I just wonder whether, from your perspective as someone who's been teaching permaculture for a while, maybe just reflecting a little bit on what you love about teaching permaculture and how you've been able to use these ideas in that to help cultivate really wonderful experiences.
Yeah, so the Cultural Emergence Toolkit is it's an embodied experience as well. It's not a theoretical understanding. It's like we might have a theoretical understanding of awareness of culture, but it's bringing it into our bodies and being able to shift our somatic experience relating to our culture. And when we come together in a group, whether that's a community group that design, with the purpose of creating a project, or whether that's on a course with the purpose of learning something, when we come together as a group, it is a somatic experience, an embodied experience that then enables you the direct connection with your own gifts, that really helps those gifts to surface, that releases you from your own web of patterns, that allows some expansion of yourself, of your own patterns, of how you perceive your own self. And I call them that creating fields of encouragement, that encouragement moves in all directions and can land with people in very different ways. So that creative spark can take someone off in a completely different direction to what you thought you were doing with them. So maybe I'm sure you've experienced this on permaculture courses, that someone comes on a course and you're teaching them about design and ecological systems, and what they go away with is, wow, I sung it, with people around the fire in the evening, and I didn't know that I could sing. And that's just shattered this limiting belief that I had about myself. Wow, what else could be different then? Or I stood up and talked in front of the group, and I didn't know that I could do that. And so it's all these other, side consequences that we might consider are just side effects, but actually can be the real tipping point and turning point for someone, that then, that belief that they had about themselves shifts another belief that they had about themselves, shifts a belief that they had about their family, about the world, about other people, that then they go away and think, what could I do now? And that might be something entirely different to what you've been teaching them about. So that's what I say, it's this embodied personal experience, but then there's also a collective experience, a collective realization that we are greater than the sum of our parts, that we can do amazing things. And there's a line, lyric from a Rising Appalachia song at the moment of, we know our might is tenfold in connection. And I love that. It's like this action when we come together, these things that we thought were immovable truths about the world we discover are these cultural assumptions that can be questioned and can be shifted.
That's beautiful. And I really love that, what you're saying about, was it the fields of encouragement? And it's really, a permaculture course is not just about the content. It's about how we all show up and build those relationships, so that something like what you describe can happen. So Looby, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about where people can get hold of this book, and what other resources that you might have available that people can dive into to learn more about the work that you do in all of its richness.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a website, cultural-emergence.com, and on there we've got resources and there's lots of videos on there, and you can get the book directly from me. You can also get it from Permanent Publications as well, my publishers, and we will be looking to release 7 Ways to Think Differently as a free ebook as well, to and just get that out into the world as well, and get that into other places. So and there's online courses happening and about to happen as well. So do check out that cultural-emergence.com, and I've got newsletters, so you'll
great.
find out
So people can subscribe there.
So also find me on Facebook as well. So there's various ways you can find out, and there's I'm training up facilitators. So I'm training up facilitators at the moment as well. So there'll be more people offering cultural emergence in different places around the world, and that will grow as well. So
so if someone wanted to become a facilitator in that, how would they go about doing that?
There's learning pathways. There's different courses that I run that focus on different elements of the toolkit. So when people have a good grasp of the content, then there'll be a facilitator training as well. So
excellent.
It is a long-term process because it is complex, and it can give you results soon, but it is a lifelong process of re-examining our culture and trying to make a difference in the world. And
then maybe when COVID finishes, people might actually be able to come and do a course with you at your permaculture centre, maybe when that all changes again.
I do hope so. Yeah, I do hope that we will be able to run courses here again. We'll see how that emerges. It's about being in a state of emergence and openness and awareness and looking for opportunities.
Yeah. And just connecting in different ways. I think there's been a really big opening of huge, global connections that are happening more than I think they were before. And I think there's a lot of possibilities for learning in that as we move ahead. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Loobby. It's been an absolute delight to catch up with you again. And I know that you're going to be joining us again actually very soon with the Perma Youth. So hopefully with one or two of your daughters joining in with the Perma Youth Festival, the next Perma Youth Festival. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to that, Morag.
Yeah. Well, until then, enjoy the last days of your winter while it's still there and your nice fires. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. It's just been an absolute delight to talk with you and also to sort of unpack a bit of some of those things that we really need to be exploring when we're diving into permaculture, that it is so much about the people care and the fair share and the ways of thinking, and that once we have that, all of the different practical tools that we learn along the way can help us to cultivate the change that we really need to see in this world. So thank you for bringing that to the fore and writing it down for us all too.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all that you put out into the world, Morag. I know you were really busy, really productive, I should say, and just in all the different areas and different people you support around the world, and really encouraging so many other people to share their gifts. Thank you.
Thanks, Loobie. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to my YouTube channel, the link's below, and then you'll be able to watch this conversation, but also make sure that you subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all new films that come out, and also the release of the extended tour of Lammas Eco-Village, where we go into the landscape and the common spaces too. And also you'll get notified of all the new all the new interviews and conversations that come out. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.